hobbyists and enthusiasts. This is the second episode of our do-it-yourself Jungle Bop drum kit series. And this episode is about converting a floor tom to a bass drum. So here's our floor tom shell. What I've already done with this shell is I've shortened it to 14 inches deep instead of 16 and cut a new bearing edge on this side. That's not necessary. You can just do a 16-inch deep bass drum, but if you want to do it like this, I did post separate videos on how to cut down the shell and how to cut these bearing edges. So just check out my other videos, and they're easy to find. They're how to cut bearing edges and how to cut down a drum shell. Those are the respective names of those two videos. So the next step for this shell, and I've also drilled holes, new holes for the lugs that we're going to have, just like I did on the rack tom to floor tom conversion at the end of the last episode. So what we're going to do next is we're going to install or prepare for installing the mount for our rack tom. Of course we could make a virgin bass drum, but since we want a Jungle Bop drum kit to be practical, I think it's better to use one of these. Now this is from a 20-inch bass drum, which means the radius is not going to match. But I have a solution for that. Stay tuned and I'll show you the solution for that just a little bit later. So, to get it nice and straight, what we're going to do is we're going to make some reference lines. So I'm going to run a line, because I figure that's a good placement for it is going to be at about this height. So I know I have a Sharpie here somewhere. A good placement for it will be with the front screw holes right along that line there. And then we're going to measure the center point between the lugs. That seam is not at the center point, so it's easy to get distracted by it. But that is not the center point, so we want to find the actual center point. 21.3. So that means the center point here is going to be 10.5, 10.6 centimeters. Right there. Same thing up here. 10.6 right there, and that way we can now draw a line which should be the center of the top of the shell. Of course, before we do this, you have to determine what's going to be your batter side, what's going to be your resonant side, and not that it really matters, and depending on what you're going to use for spurs, often it might be helpful to use the former resonant side as the new resonant side, because if you're going to use old-fashioned spurs, you might be able to reuse the same holes for the floor tom leg brackets as your spur brackets. That won't work with what we're doing, but it could possibly work for your project. So with that cross done, luckily this particular platform, tom mounting platform, came with one of those back plates, which makes it quite easy to mark the holes because you can use it as a template. So we've got to mark that, and we've got to mark that, and we've got to mark that. And we have to mark these two big holes for where the post holes goes through. And at that point, we're ready to drill some holes. And this, of course, is done in the same manner as when we converted the rack tom to a floor tom. You want to drill from the outside first until you feel the point of that brad point drill pit poke through on the back side, and then we stop and proceed on to the other two until that pokes through and pokes through. And then switch it around and drill the rest from the inside, and that way we get a nice clean hole both on the inside and on the outside. Now, for making the large holes where the posts poke through, you can use a spade bit, or you can use a Forstner bit. The Forstner bit would probably make a little bit of a neater hole. I don't have any, so I'm going to use a spade bit. But the process is the exact same. I make it a lot bigger. Like the standard size for these is 7/8. The hole in here is more like closer to 1 inch, and I'm going to use a 1-inch spade bit because I have one kicking around. As long as it's a little bit bigger than the standard 7/8, you're going to be good. And we do it the exact same way. Make into the first ply from the outside. You have to make sure from the outside that it cuts into the first ply, and then, just like before, we can make the rest from the inside. It's actually a bit of an awkward angle from the inside, but because I've cut through the first ply on the inside, I can actually from the outside. Probably need to increase the torque. One, and two. And there we have it. We've prepared for the tom mounting platform. Now we're moving on to spurs. I have these nifty little lightweight spurs from an entry-level kit, obviously. And what I've done is I've determined the position of them. So I looked at where they came from to determine where they go on the shell, and on the shell they came from, in order to get the right angle here, where they came from, they were just below the center of the shell. So that's what I did here too. I just determined a distance from this, the center line of this lug line, and I moved it down, made a parallel line to that, and marked the first two holes by deciding on a distance from the edge of the shell, and then the distance between the holes, and then the distance from this line to this line, move that here, and then again by measuring the distance from the edge of the shell, distance from the edge of the shell, I've determined the three positions. And then all we have to do is transpose those same measurements to the other side and then drill on both sides. So I've gone ahead and drilled the holes in the same manner as last time. Before I move on to wrapping this shell, this is the right time to talk about bass drum risers. So there are three popular types of bass drum risers for 16-inch bass drums. Manufacturers like Pearl and Yamaha use a style that, with a post that comes through the bottom of the shell on the batter side. And the advantage of that is it makes the batter side height adjustable, which in turn makes the entire drum shell height adjustable. Sonor and Odery use a style where the riser sits on a floor tom bracket on the batter side, and it's a post that's bent like this with a little plate on it to attach the pedal to. The advantage of that is that it's adjustable depth-wise, but not height-wise. And Ludwig's breakbeats use a riser of the same style that is often used with 18-inch and sometimes with 20-inch bass drums even, and that's the type that clamps onto the hoop. Has a couple of disadvantages. It does not allow any adjustment, and you have to use actual bass drum hoops. You cannot use just regular tom-tom rims with that method. The advantage is you don't have to do any further installation onto the shell, and it is very portable, nifty, and handy, very lightweight little contraption. On this particular project, we're going to go that route, but I will do other projects in the future where we explore the other routes as well. But on this particular project, we're going to go with the one that clamps onto the hoop, which means we are going to have to make actual bass drum hoops, but we don't have to install anything else on this bass drum. So I can go ahead and wrap it and install the various metal parts. Stay tuned, we're going to move on to that. Installed. We've got the spurs installed. The lugs are those old made in Japan lugs, and they actually match the lugs on the toms pretty well. They look very similar except much bigger, which works out really good. So now we're going to address the mismatch of radius between the tom mounting platform and the radius of the shell, because the tom mounting platform is donated for a much bigger drum. There's a couple of ways of doing this. In this case, because the mismatch isn't that big, we could simply get away with just making an isolation gasket to put in between. And if you look at my other videos, you'll find a video about how to make your own isolation gaskets. I don't want to do that in this case, since we don't have isolation gaskets anywhere else. It's going to look a little bit odd. But we are still going to kill two birds in one stone, in that we are going to add some isolation between the platform and the shell while we solve the issue with the mismatch. So, see these little rubber feet? They're typically used for speakers or furniture or something like that. I'm going to put one of those right at each corner, outside corner, because that's where our mismatch is. That's where we need to fill a gap a little bit, and that takes care of the issue. And like I said, we're killing two birds with one stone, because we're also adding a pretty decent degree of isolation between the shell and the hardware, almost to the level of a suspension mount. That's it. That's our handy dandy solution. Tune in for the next episode, when I'm going to show you how to make our own bass drum hoops. You can always just order 16-inch bass drum hoops, but they're kind of pricey. And I don't like the simple steel ones, like the ones that the brake beats come with. I do prefer the solid ones that look like wooden ones, or actually made of wood ones. And that's what I'm going to show you how to make. Stay tuned, coming up soon.